In the endless copper dunes of a distant world, a shattered vessel lies silent, its crew stranded and dying of thirst. But when the storm fades, something stirs outside the wreckage. A shadow, larger than the ship itself, circles with claws scraping against metal, and eyes glowing like fire in the night. It does not attack, it knocks. And in that moment, the survivors realize they are not alone, and what waits beyond the hull may decide if they live or vanish forever. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video, and tell us where are you watching from. Now, let's jump into the story. The copper sands of Orion 9 stretched endlessly in every direction. The dunes shifted under the pull of twin moons, glowing faintly in the fractured sky. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and dust, a taste that clung to the tongue and burned the throat. Silence ruled the desert, broken only by the groan of twisted metal half buried in the sand. The wreckage of the exploration vessel lay scattered like the bones of a fallen giant. Its hull was cracked, its engines torn apart, and its beacon silent. 3 days had passed since the crash, and the desert had shown no mercy. The sunless sky gave no warmth, only a pale light that stretched shadows across the dunes. Inside the broken ship, 5 survivors clung to life. Their bodies were weak, their lips cracked, and their eyes hollow from thirst. The water reserves had run dry on the first day. The emergency beacon had failed before it could send a signal. Someone had tampered with the systems before launch. Someone had wanted them to vanish. Captain Darren Vale sat against the wall of the shattered cockpit. Once a decorated strategist, his sharp mind now fought against the haze of dehydration. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his face lined with exhaustion. He stared at the fractured glass above him, where faint light filtered through. Medals and victories from the past meant nothing here. Survival was the only measure left. Beside him lay Lieutenant Iris Calder. Her scarred cheek told the story of battles long past, but her spirit had always been unbroken. Now her strength was fading. Her voice, once sharp with wit, was hoarse and dry. She tried to keep the others awake with words, but even her humor could not hide the truth. Their time was slipping away. Sergeant Brent Halden, known to his comrades as Stone, shifted his massive frame against the floor. His strength had carried them through countless missions, but thirst had reduced him to weakness. His voice was low, yet he forced a smile as he spoke. He reminded them of promises made by recruiters, of adventure and glory. But this was not glory. This was survival against silence. Ensign Leora Kane, the youngest among them, leaned against the shattered console. Her red hair hung loose, her eyes dim but still alert. She had once held a line against impossible odds, proving her courage beyond her years. Now she fought against the weight of despair. She whispered that adventure was not about battles won, but about living to tell the story. Dr. Silas Marin, the medic, sat quietly in the corner. His green eyes had seen too much death, and he knew the signs of bodies failing. He measured their breaths, their fading pulses, and the dryness of their skin. He did not speak of it, but he knew how little time remained. His silence was not weakness, it was truth. The air inside the wreckage was stifling. The metal walls expanded and contracted with the heat of the shifting moons. Each sound echoed like a dying breath. Outside, the wind rose, carrying waves of copper sand against the hull. The sound was almost like a song, a dirge for the forgotten. The survivors listened to the storm and wondered if this was how their story would end. No rescue, no signal, only silence and sand. Yet even in despair, There was a spark. Darren forced himself to sit straighter, his hand brushing against the useless sidearm at his belt. He knew it held no charge, but the gesture reminded him of purpose. Iris broke the silence with a whisper. She asked if anyone still believed in breathing tomorrow. Her words were half a joke, half a plea. Stone answered with a weak laugh, saying that if they were to die, at least they had seen the stars of Orion 9. Leora added that stories were not always about victory. Sometimes they were about endurance. Silas finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. He told them that survival was not measured in hours or days, but in choices. They could surrender to despair, or they could hold on until the last breath. His words carried weight, not because they promised rescue, but because they reminded them of dignity. The wind outside grew stronger. The wreckage shook under the force of the storm. Sand poured through cracks in the hull, covering the floor in a fine red layer. The survivors closed their eyes, listening to the storm's voice. It was then that they heard something new. A low vibration rose from beneath the sand. It was not the wind. It was not the groan of metal. It was deeper, heavier, like the growl of something alive. The sound rolled through the wreckage, rattling the walls and stirring fear in their hearts. Darren opened his eyes and looked at the others. No one spoke. They all heard it. The sound came again, closer this time, shaking the floor beneath them. Claws scraped against the outer hull, sharp and deliberate. The survivors held their breath. Something was circling the wreckage, something massive. The storm outside howled, but the sound of the creature was louder. It was not the voice of the desert. It was the voice of something ancient, something powerful, something that had found them in the silence. Inside the broken ship, 5 hearts beat faster. They had been waiting for rescue. Instead, something else had come. The silent wreckage was no longer silent. The storm outside the wreckage of the vessel grew louder. The copper sand struck the hull with a steady rhythm, like a drumbeat echoing across the desert. Inside, the survivors sat in silence, their bodies weak, but their senses sharp. Every sound mattered now. Every vibration could mean life or death. Then it came again, the deep growl that none of them could explain. It was not the wind. It was not the shifting of metal. It was something alive. The sound rolled through the broken ship, shaking the floor beneath them. Captain Darren Vale forced himself upright, his hand resting on the useless sidearm at his belt. His eyes met those of Lieutenant Iris Calder. She did not speak, but her expression told him she heard it too. The others shifted, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide. The sound grew closer. Claws scraped against the outer hull, sharp and deliberate. The survivors froze. The wreckage groaned as if something massive pressed against it. Shadows moved across the fractured glass of the viewport. Sergeant Brent Halden whispered that it was circling them. His voice was low, almost lost in the storm, but the fear in it was clear. Ensign Leora Kane leaned forward, her body trembling, her eyes fixed on the shifting light above. Dr. Silas Marin closed his eyes, listening carefully, his mind racing through possibilities. The scraping stopped. Silence filled the wreckage again, but it was not the silence of safety. It was the silence of something waiting. Then came the sound of breathing, heavy, steady, and close. The survivors held their breath. The air inside the wreckage felt heavier, as if the presence outside was pressing down on them. The storm raged, but the sound of the creature's breath was louder. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the cracked viewport. It was massive, blocking the pale light of the moons. The survivors stared upward, their hearts pounding. The shadow shifted, revealing the outline of something with wings folded tight against its body. The creature lowered its head, and for the first time, they saw it. Scales shimmered in the dim light, shifting from emerald green to violet as it moved. 4 golden eyes glowed with intelligence, watching them closely. Its snout was long, its nostrils flaring as it breathed in the scent of the wreckage. It was no myth. It was no hallucination. It was a dragon, not of Earth, but of Orion 9. Evolution had shaped it into a form both familiar and alien. Its body stretched longer than the wrecked vessel. Its wings folded like a cloak across its back. Its claws dug into the sand, leaving deep marks that filled quickly with dust. The survivors could not look away. Fear held them, but so did awe. The creature tilted its head, studying them with curiosity. Then it did something none of them expected. It raised one massive claw and tapped the hull. 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the wreckage. The sound was clear. It was not random. It was intentional. Iris whispered that it was knocking. Her voice trembled, but her words carried disbelief. Brent muttered that maybe it was polite, asking permission before it ate them. Leora's lips parted, but no words came. Silas opened his eyes and stared at the creature, his mind struggling to understand. The dragon tapped again, this time harder, the sound ringing through the broken ship. Then it lowered its head and released a low rumble. A sound that was not a growl, but something closer to a hum. The vibration filled the wreckage. Resonating in their bones, Darren's hand tightened on his sidearm, though he knew it was useless. The charge pack had been drained days ago. Still, the gesture gave him strength. He whispered that, whatever it was not acting like a predator. Predators did not knock. Predators did not wait. The survivors exchanged glances. Their fear was real, but so was their confusion. The dragon's golden eyes glowed brighter, reflecting the fractured light of the moons. It tilted its head again, as if waiting for a response. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind softened, and the sand settled. The desert grew quiet, leaving only the sound of the creature's breath and the faint hum it produced. Inside, the survivors sat in silence, their minds racing. Was this a trick of dehydration? Was this a hallucination born of thirst and exhaustion? Or was it real? The dragon tapped the hull once more, then snorted, releasing a burst of hot air that rattled the wreckage. The survivors flinched, but the creature did not attack. Instead, it stepped back, its wings shifting slightly, sending waves of sand into the air. The survivors stared at one another. Something was happening that none of them could explain. Something that defied every rule of survival they had known. The shadow outside was no longer just a threat. It was a mystery, a presence that demanded attention. Darren whispered that they had a choice. They could stay silent and wait for death, or they could answer. The others looked at him, their faces pale, their bodies weak, but their eyes alive with fear and wonder. The dragon lowered its head again, its golden eyes fixed on them. It tapped the hull once more, patient and deliberate. The survivors held their breath. The shadow that circled was no longer circling. It was waiting. And in that moment, they realized the desert was not empty. It was watching. The storm outside had faded, leaving the desert of Orion 9 strangely quiet. Inside the wreckage, the survivors sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the massive creature that loomed beyond the cracked viewport. The dragon-like being had tapped the hull again, patient and deliberate, as if waiting for an answer. Captain Darren Vale felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. His throat was dry, his body weak, but his mind was still sharp enough to recognize the truth. This was no random beast. This was something that wanted to be understood. Lieutenant Iris Calder leaned closer to the wall of the wreckage. Her scarred face was pale, but her eyes burned with curiosity. She whispered that the rhythm of the knocks was not random. It carried a pattern, a sequence that repeated. She said it was almost like code. Sergeant Brent Halden shook his head, his voice rough. He said predators did not knock. Predators did not wait. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed his fear. He was a soldier built for strength. But this was something beyond strength. This was survival through understanding. Ensign Leora Kane pressed her trembling hand against the metal wall. Her lips were cracked, her body weak, but her spirit had not broken. She whispered that maybe the creature was trying to speak. She said that if it wanted them dead, they would already be gone. Dr. Silas Marin studied the creature through the fractured glass. His calm voice broke the silence. He said that intelligence was written in its eyes. He said that survival was not always about weapons or power. Sometimes survival was about listening. The dragon lowered its head again. Its golden eyes glowed brighter, and it released a low hum that vibrated through the wreckage. The sound was deep, steady, and rhythmic. It was not a growl. It was closer to a song. Iris tapped her hand against the wall. 3 short beats, followed by a pause. The others stared at her, their eyes wide. She said that if it was a code, they had to answer. The creature froze. Its eyes narrowed, and then it tapped the hole again, this time matching her rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, then another. The survivors gasped. It was not imagination. It was not a trick of thirst. It was communication. Leora forced herself to sit straighter. She tapped again, changing the rhythm slightly. The dragon tilted its head, then responded with the same change. The wreckage filled with silence as the survivors realized what was happening. They were speaking, not with words, but with rhythm. It was a language of survival, born from desperation and curiosity. Darren's voice was low but steady. He said they had to keep going. He said this was their chance. The dragon released another hum, longer this time, and its claws scraped the sand in a deliberate pattern. Silas whispered that it was showing them more than sound. It was showing them symbols. Iris traced the marks in the sand with her eyes. She said they looked like waves, rising and falling. She said it could mean water. The survivors stared at one another. Water, the one thing they needed most. Brent laughed weakly, his voice breaking. He said if the creature was offering water, then maybe it was not their enemy. Maybe it was their only hope. The dragon tapped again, then lowered its head until its snout nearly touched the cracked viewport. Its breath fogged the glass, and its golden eyes glowed with something that looked like patience. Leora whispered that it was waiting for trust. Darren's hand tightened on his useless sidearm. He looked at the others, then slowly lowered the weapon to the floor. He said survival was not about fear. It was about choices. Iris tapped the wall again, a slow rhythm that ended with a pause. The dragon responded with the same rhythm, then released a low hum that shook the wreckage. The survivors felt the vibration in their bones. It was not threatening. It was steady, almost comforting. Silas said that this was not a predator. This was a being that understood suffering. He said it was reaching out, and they had to decide whether to reach back. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, silent and merciless. Inside, 5 survivors faced a choice that would decide their fate. They could cling to fear and die in silence, or they could trust the unknown and live. The dragon tapped the hull one final time, then stepped back, its wings shifting against the sand. It waited, its golden eyes fixed on them. Darren looked at his crew. He saw fear, but he also saw hope. He nodded once, and Iris tapped the wall again, a clear signal of acceptance. The dragon released a deep hum, louder than before, and the wreckage shook with the sound. It was not a warning. It was an answer. The survivors realized they had spoken across the barrier of species, ... Across the silence of the desert. They had found a language of survival. And in that moment, for the first time since the crash, they believed they might live. The desert of Orion 9 stretched silent and endless, its copper dunes glowing faintly under the twin moons. The wreckage of the fallen vessel lay half-buried, a broken shell that had sheltered the survivors for 3 long days. Inside, 5 weary figures sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the massive creature that waited outside. The dragon-like being stood tall against the shifting sands. Its scales shimmered with colors that shifted from deep violet to emerald green. Its 4 golden eyes glowed with patience, watching the survivors through the cracked viewport. It had knocked, it had hummed, and it had answered their signals. Now it waited for their choice. Captain Darren Vale felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His body was weak, his lips dry, but his mind was clear. Survival was no longer about weapons or strength. It was about trust. He looked at his crew, each one broken by thirst, but still alive with hope. Lieutenant Iris Calder leaned against the wall, her scar catching the faint light. She whispered that the creature was not their enemy. She said its rhythm, its patience, and its eyes all spoke of something more. She believed it was offering them a chance. Sergeant Brent Halden shifted his massive frame, his voice rough but steady. He admitted that fear had ruled him since the crash, but fear had not saved them. He said survival demanded courage, and courage meant stepping into the unknown. Ensign Leora Kane, the youngest among them, pressed her hand against the cracked glass. Her voice was faint, but her words carried strength. She said that stories of survival were not written by those who hid. They were written by those who dared to trust. Dr. Silas Marin, the medic, studied the creature with calm eyes. He said its behavior was not that of a predator. He said it had shown empathy, patience, and intelligence. He believed it understood their suffering. He believed it wanted to help. The dragon lowered its head, its breath fogging the glass. Then it released a slow exhale, a mist that drifted across the sand. The survivors watched in disbelief as the mist condensed into droplets of water, pooling on the copper ground. Their eyes widened. Water, the one thing they needed most. Darren forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling. He looked at his crew, then at the hatch. He said survival was not about waiting for rescue. It was about making choices. He said they had to open the door. The others hesitated, fear still clinging to them. But one by one, they nodded. Iris placed her hand on the release lever. Brent steadied her with his strength. Leora whispered a quiet prayer. Silas gave a final nod. The hatch groaned as it opened, the desert air rushing inside. The survivors stepped out onto the sand, their bodies weak but their spirits alive. The dragon stood before them, its golden eyes glowing brighter under the moons. It lowered its head, pressing its snout close to the ground. The survivors approached slowly, their steps unsteady. The mist still lingered, and droplets of water glistened on the sand. Silas bent down, scooping the liquid into his hands. He tasted it, then nodded. It was pure. It was life. The survivors drank, their cracked lips finally quenched. Strength returned to their bodies, and hope returned to their hearts. For the first time since the crash, they felt alive. The dragon watched them silently, its wings shifting against its back. Then it lowered itself further, folding its massive body into the sand. It extended one wing, creating a slope that led to its back. The survivors stared in disbelief. The meaning was clear. It was offering them passage. Darren stepped forward, his voice steady. He said this was not chance. This was a pact. The desert had tested them, and the creature had chosen them. He said survival was no longer about fear. It was about trust in the unknown. One by one, the survivors climbed onto the creature's back. Brent pulled Leora up with his strength. Iris steadied Silas as he climbed. Darren was the last, his eyes scanning the endless dunes before turning to the creature. The dragon rose slowly, its massive wings unfolding. The sand swirled around them as it lifted into the air, carrying the survivors above the desert. The wreckage grew smaller below, a broken shell left behind. The survivors clung to the creature, their fear replaced by awe. The desert stretched endlessly beneath them, but from above, it no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a path. The dragon soared higher, its wings cutting through the night sky. The survivors felt the wind on their faces, the weight of despair lifting from their shoulders. They were no longer trapped. They were no longer waiting for death. They had made a choice. They had trusted the unknown, and in return, the unknown had carried them into life. As the dragon vanished into the horizon, the survivors realized that survival was not about strength or weapons. It was about connection. It was about courage. It was about trust. The desert of Orion 9 had given them a trial. The dragon had given them a pact. Together they had written a story not of despair, but of hope. And so the wreckage was left behind, silent once more. But the survivors were no longer part of it. They had become part of something greater. The pact of the dunes was sealed, not with words, but with trust. And in that trust, they found life.